At least an hour before I can make it there. Just keep her contained and don't engage, he instructed. And Mason, make sure all your evidence is ready. If what you're saying is true, this might be the thing that finally sticks. Hung up, heart pounding in my chest. Diane's screams had quieted into muffled curses. Through the camera's mic, I heard her pacing the cellar, occasionally jiggling the door handle. I double-checked the live feed from all angles, then opened my secure folder and began organizing the footage. Her picking the lock, walking in with the tote bag, pulling out the weed killer. I clipped each file with a timestamp and prepared a full incident report while I waited for the sheriff. This wasn't just some petty neighborhood squabble anymore. This was criminal trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and potentially environmental damage. Charges serious enough to warrant real legal action. An hour and 15 minutes later, I saw headlights bounce across the gravel drive. Moment later, Sheriff Donahue stepped out of his cruiser, rubbing his eyes and muttering under his breath. I met him outside, handed him a flash drive with the footage, and led him to the cellar. "You sure she's okay down there?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded. "She's been yelling for a lawyer, not help. She's not hurt, just angry she got caught." He knocked on the cellar door. "Ms. Wellington, this is Sheriff Donahue. I need you to stay calm. We're going to open the door, and I expect you to remain cooperative." "Understood?" Her reply was something halfway between a sob and a snarl. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Donahue. I've been kidnapped. This lunatic locked me in a bunker." The sheriff sighed, clearly already exhausted by what was going to be a long night. He nodded at me, and I remotely disengaged the electronic lock. The door creaked open. Diane stormed out in her designer tracksuit, hair frizzed, tote bag still in hand. "I want him arrested, right now." But before she could launch into a tirade, the sheriff held up his hand. "Ms. Wellington, we have video evidence of you trespassing, breaking a lock, and entering this man's cellar with hazardous chemicals. I suggest you take a breath before you say anything else." She froze, her face a contorted mask of disbelief and fury. "Video?" "He set me up. He must have doctored. It's all time-stamped and it's crystal clear," I said, holding up my phone. "You broke in with the weed killer. I didn't touch a frame of that footage." Sheriff Donahue spoke into his radio, requesting backup and transport. Diane's expression shifted. Panic flickered behind her eyes. "You don't know who I am," she hissed. "I own this neighborhood. You think some root cellar and heirloom tomatoes matter?" "I think they matter more than lies and poison," I replied calmly. By the time the deputies arrived, Diane had gone silent. She was escorted to the cruiser, clutching her now empty tote. Sheriff Donahue stayed behind a moment longer to collect statements and copy the full security footage. "You did everything right, Mason," he said as he packed up. "Frankly, I'm impressed you kept your cool. This could have gone sideways in 100 different ways." "Honestly, Sheriff," I said, watching the taillights fade into the night. "I was just protecting what my grandfather built, and I wasn't going to let someone like her tear it down." As I stood under the cold, clear stars of a Minnesota night, the adrenaline began to fade. I was exhausted, but I felt something else too. Vindication. Diane Wellington thought she could bully her way through life. She thought money and connections would protect her from consequences. But in a town built on legacy, where neighbors remember your name and your grandfather's name before you, that kind of arrogance only goes so far. I walked back to the farmhouse, past the chicken coop and the dark silhouette of the greenhouse. The root cellar door was still ajar, a quiet symbol of what had nearly been lost. I paused to close it gently, locking it behind me. The harvest was safe. Justice was in motion. And Diane? Well, she was about to find out that in this town no one, not even an HOA queen, was above the law. Full financial compensation, a signed non-harassment agreement, and a complete explanation for your actions, the sheriff continued, his voice low and deliberate. "Frankly, I think that's a generous offer considering what you've done." Diane's mouth twisted like she'd bitten into something rotten. For a moment, she looked like she might lash out, say something to make everything worse. But then, her eyes met Gregory's, and whatever she saw there, whether it was anger, resignation, or the cold calculation of a man done protecting someone who'd become a liability, stopped her. "I want a lawyer," she finally muttered, her voice stripped of the usual haughtiness. "Now." "That's your right," Sheriff Donahue said, gesturing toward his cruiser. "But you'll be coming with me in the meantime." Gregory turned to me as the sheriff escorted Diane, now eerily silent, toward the patrol vehicle. His eyes, once full of disdain, now held something that looked a lot like reluctant respect. "Mr. Redfield," he said stiffly, "I'll be in touch regarding the terms of your proposal. You have my word we'll settle this quickly and quietly." Gave him a short nod. "I'm not looking for revenge, just peace. And I'm tired of being the one under siege." With a curt nod, Gregory turned and followed after the sheriff, disappearing into the night as the patrol car's red and blue lights flickered across the trees. I stood alone for a long moment in the chill October air, the silence finally complete. No shouting, no scheming, no rustling in the bushes. Just the slow, rhythmic crunch of leaves under the sheriff's boots as he walked Diane to the cruiser, and the faint hum of the containment tank, quietly collecting truth drop by drop. Inside, the monitors still played back the evening's drama, clear, indisputable evidence that, for once, justice hadn't just knocked. It had kicked the damn door down. I took one last look at the cellar, then at the security cameras blinking red in the dark, and stepped back into the warmth of my home. Tomorrow, I'd begin repairs. But tonight, I allowed myself something rare. On this long, relentless journey, peace. Real peace. Not because the storm had passed, but because finally, I had learned to build a shelter strong enough to withstand it. Wellington Chemical, until it was sold in the 90s. Diane shot her husband a venomous look before continuing. This entire area was contaminated with industrial waste. The company was supposed to clean it up before selling off parcels of the land, but corners were cut. Your grandfather bought this property at a suspiciously low price because the proper remediation was never completed. I was the waste management director at the time. She paused, her voice dropping. If anyone ever tested this soil thoroughly, especially around that root cellar where some of the worst dumping occurred, the liability would be enormous. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, perhaps literally, given what I was hearing. "You've been trying to drive me off this land or destroy my crops because you're afraid I'll discover your family poisoned it." "It wasn't just me," Diane snapped. "It was company policy. And when I saw you moving in and starting to dig up the soil for your precious organic garden, I knew it was only a matter of time before you discovered something. I tried to buy you out first, that would have been the cleanest, but you were so stubborn about your family legacy." Her voice dripped with contempt on those last two words. Sheriff Donahue had been silent during the exchange, but now he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wellington, are you admitting to knowledge of illegal toxic waste disposal and a subsequent cover-up?" The color drained from Diane's face as she seemed to realize the full implications of what she had just revealed. Gregory stepped slightly away from his wife, his body language changing subtly but unmistakably. A lawyer distancing himself from a client who had just confessed to a crime. "I think," Gregory said carefully, "that we should continue this conversation after my wife has had proper legal counsel. Someone other than myself, given the circumstances." Sheriff Donahue nodded gravely. "I believe that would be wise. Mrs. Wellington, I'm placing you under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and, based on your own statements, possible environmental crimes. You have the right to remain silent." He continued reading her rights as he gently but firmly took her arm and led her toward his patrol car. Diane protested and threatened lawsuits, but I stood silent, processing everything I had just learned. I wasn't feeling the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, a hollow feeling settled in my stomach as I watched this woman who had caused me so much grief being taken away in handcuffs. Olivia Harper, my friend and environmental consultant who had arrived during the commotion, after I'd texted, her approached and stood beside me. "You don't seem as happy as I would have expected," she observed quietly. "I'm not," I admitted, Looking at her like this, I wonder what turns a person into someone who would go to such lengths. Power, money, or just the fear of being exposed. Could any of us put in similar circumstances become something like that? After a moment of reflection, I looked back toward my farmhouse and the land I had come to love. Now I've dealt with Diane. But what about my land? Is it even safe to farm? Olivia, with her background in environmental science, promised to help me test the soil thoroughly and explore remediation options if needed. Gregory, looking shaken and 10 years older than when he'd arrived, approached us before leaving. "I had no idea about any of this," he said quietly. "I'll ensure you receive compensation for everything, Mr. Redfield, and I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. My firm specializes in corporate law, but I can refer you to excellent environmental attorneys." In the weeks that followed, my property became something of a scientific research site. Olivia brought in a team of colleagues from her environmental consulting firm, and together they conducted a comprehensive analysis of my entire 5 acres. The process was both fascinating and terrifying. Workers in hazmat suits meticulously took core samples from different depths across the property, paying special attention to the area around the root cellar, where Diane had indicated the worst dumping had occurred. Each evening, Olivia would come to my kitchen table with new data and maps. "We're finding consistent patterns of contamination," she explained one night, spreading out color-coded soil profile charts. "The good news is that it's mostly contained to specific pockets rather than dispersed throughout the entire property. The bad news is that some of these chemicals are persistent organic pollutants, PCBs, dioxins, and heavy metals that don't break down naturally over time." Her finger traced a red zone that devastatingly overlapped with my prized vegetable garden. "This area has the highest concentration. Did your grandfather ever mention that nothing would grow well here?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I remembered my grandfather's casual comment years ago that the east side of the property was stubborn soil. It had been his explanation for why he'd established the garden on the western edge instead. He hadn't known he was protecting his family from invisible poison. He knew something was wrong, but not what, I said quietly. The realization that I had been eating vegetables grown in potentially contaminated soil turned my stomach. Immediate testing of my stored produce confirmed my fears. Subtle but measurable levels of contaminants had made their way into my carefully tended harvest. Meanwhile, the legal machinery ground forward. The EPA and state environmental agencies descended on the property with their own testing protocols. Subpoenas were filed for Wellington Chemical's historical records, and former employees began coming forward with their own stories. One elderly man who had worked as a night watchman in the 70s provided particularly damning testimony, describing how trucks would arrive after midnight to dump barrels into hastily dug pits around what was now my property. The investigation expanded beyond my land. Other properties that had once been part of Wellington Chemical's holdings were tested, revealing similar contamination patterns. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had blown open a decades-old environmental crime that affected dozens of families. Class action lawsuits were filed, regulatory agencies issued violations, and the current corporate owner of what had once been Wellington Chemical found itself in the crosshairs of multiple investigations. Through it all, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Vindication, certainly. Diane's harassment had been exposed for what it was, a desperate attempt to cover up her past crimes, but also grief for what had been lost. My grandfather's farm, the legacy I had hoped to continue, was literally poisoned ground. The vegetables I had so proudly grown were potentially harmful. The dream I had embraced when I left Chicago seemed to be crumbling, contaminated, like the soil itself. The remediation process began in early spring, nearly 6 months after that fateful night in the root cellar. The corporate successor to Wellington Chemical, facing crippling legal liability, agreed to fund a complete cleanup of all affected properties. For me, this meant a temporary relocation, while my entire property underwent a massive transformation. Specialized crews removed the top 3 feet of soil from the most contaminated areas, replacing it with clean fill. Groundwater filtering systems were installed. My carefully built garden beds were completely excavated, the beloved heirloom soil that had nurtured my vegetables carted away in trucks marked hazardous material. I moved into a small apartment in town, visiting the property only occasionally to check on progress. Each visit was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The farmhouse stood like an island amid a sea of churned earth, construction equipment, and industrial machinery. The chickens had been relocated to a sanctuary farm until it was safe for them to return. My greenhouse had been dismantled, its potentially contaminated soil removed. The root cellar, the epicenter of both the contamination and Diane's downfall, had been completely gutted, its shelves and contents carefully tested and mostly destroyed. Those months of displacement gave me plenty of time to reflect and rebuild, not just my property, but my vision for the future. I found unexpected support from the community, including many neighbors who had initially been suspicious of me based on Diane's rumors. Mrs. Kellerman, the elderly neighbor who had once brought me homemade jam, now brought casseroles to my apartment and sat with me as I worked through my options. Land has memory, she told me one evening, but it also has forgiveness. This soil knew your grandfather's care, and it will know yours again. I spent long evenings with Olivia, not just discussing soil remediation techniques, but reimagining what the farm could become. Our professional relationship deepened into something more personal as we sketched plans for a new kind of operation, one that would not only be safe but could serve as an educational model for land recovery and sustainable agriculture. "This doesn't have to be the end of your dream," she said, her hand covering mine across a table spread with blueprints. "It can be the beginning of something even more meaningful." Slowly, I began to see the land's contamination not as an ending, but as part of its story. And mine. My grandfather had unknowingly purchased poisoned ground, but had loved it. Anyway, coaxing life from its healthier portions, now I had the chance to heal it completely, to make it whole in a way he never could. With each passing week, as the remediation progressed and Olivia's monitoring showed improving conditions, my sense of purpose strengthened. This wasn't just about growing vegetables anymore. It was about regeneration, about taking something broken and making it not just functional, but flourishing. A year later, I sat in the back row of the county courthouse, watching as Diane Wellington stood to receive her sentence. The trial had been a media sensation from the start, drawing national attention as a perfect storm of compelling elements. Environmental crime, wealthy privilege, neighborly disputes gone nuclear, and of course the irresistible narrative of a Diane whose entitlement had finally caught up with her. The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental activists, and neighbors who had their own stories of harassment from Diane over the years. The 7-month trial had revealed far more than even I had suspected. Financial records showed that Wellington Chemical had saved over $20 million by illegally disposing of waste on what would become my property, and several others. Internal memos, preserved by a conscientious secretary who had suspected wrongdoing, documented how Diane had personally directed the night dumping operations and later orchestrated the falsification of cleanup reports. Perhaps most damning were the medical records from 3 former residents of properties adjacent to contamination sites, all of whom had developed rare cancers consistent with exposure to the specific chemicals found on my land. Throughout the proceedings, Diane had maintained the same haughty demeanor I'd become so familiar with, seemingly convinced that her wealth and connections would ultimately shield her from serious consequences. Her legal team had cycled through various defenses, from challenging the legality of my security videos, to claiming ignorance of the company's disposal practices, to ultimately trying to shift blame to deceased executives who couldn't defend themselves. None of it had worked. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Now, as the judge prepared to announce her sentence, I noticed Diane's practiced composure finally cracking. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and the confident tilt of her chin had given way to a nervous tightening around her mouth. She wore an expertly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, but no amount of expensive tailoring could hide the physical toll the trial had taken. She had aged a decade in a year. Diane Wellington, the judge began, her voice stern and measured. This court has found you guilty of 27 counts of illegal toxic waste disposal, 16 counts of falsifying environmental records, 11 counts of perjury, and 1 count each of breaking and entering and attempted destruction of property. She paused, looking directly at Diane over her reading glasses. These crimes span decades and reflect a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a complete disregard for the law, for the environment, and for the health and safety of your community. The judge continued, outlining how Diane's actions had potentially endangered hundreds of people over decades, all to save money and protect her family's reputation. While your financial crimes have harmed many, it is your willingness to potentially sacrifice the health of entire families, including children, for your own benefit that this court finds particularly reprehensible. When the sentence was announced, 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, fines totaling $4.5 million, and a court-ordered public apology to be published in major media outlets, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was substantially more than the prosecution had requested. Diane swayed slightly, her attorney gripping her elbow to steady her. For the first time, I saw genuine fear replace the entitlement in her eyes. As the bailiff led her away, Diane locked eyes with me briefly. There was no remorse there, only a smoldering resentment. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only a profound sadness that someone could be so consumed by self-interest that even now, facing the consequences of her actions, she could feel nothing but anger at being caught. Outside the courthouse, a media frenzy awaited. I had largely avoided the spotlight throughout the trial, but today I had agreed to a single statement. Flanked by Olivia and several other property owners affected by the contamination, I stepped up to the forest of microphones. Today isn't about revenge, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's about accountability. Ms. Wellington's crimes weren't just against me or my property. They were against all of us who believe that clean soil, water, and air aren't luxuries, but basic rights. No one, regardless of wealth or status, should be able to poison our communities and walk away. I paused, looking at the sea of cameras. My grandfather taught me that land is a trust, not just a possession. Today, that trust has been honored. The story exploded across social media platforms and news outlets. Diane Cellar and Root Cellar Justice became trending hashtags. Memes featuring Diane's courtroom scowl, juxtaposed with my security footage, circulated widely. Environmental groups highlighted the case as a rare example of an individual executive being held personally accountable for corporate environmental crimes. Law schools began incorporating the case into their environmental law curricula. Perhaps most significantly, 3 different production companies approached me about documentary rights to the story. After careful consideration, I selected a respected filmmaker known for nuanced environmental storytelling rather than sensationalism. The resulting film, Underground Truths, The Root Cellar Case, would later win critical acclaim and bring even wider attention to the issues of corporate pollution and accountability. 2 years after Diane began serving her sentence, life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated since that night I watched her breaking into my root cellar. The remediation of my property was complete, with monitoring wells showing clear improvements in soil and groundwater quality. The farmhouse had been thoroughly renovated, with special filtering systems ensuring that any lingering contaminants wouldn't affect indoor air quality. The greenhouse had been rebuilt, now housing experimental plots demonstrating phytoremediation, using specific plants to extract remaining metals from the soil. Most significantly, the root cellar itself had been reimagined. Rather than simply restoring it to its original purpose, Olivia and I had transformed it into a small but powerful educational exhibit. One section retained the traditional storage function, demonstrating sustainable food preservation techniques. But the majority now served as a compact museum, documenting both the environmental crimes and the restoration process. Glass cases displayed soil core samples showing the contamination layers alongside the now cleaned profiles. Interactive displays explained the science of bioremediation. And yes, in a small case by itself, sat the bottle of weed killer that had triggered the entire investigation, preserved as a reminder of how one act of malice had inadvertently led to healing and justice. Olivia and I married in a simple ceremony on the property, surrounded by the native wildflowers and remediation plantings that now covered what had once been contaminated ground. Our wedding favors were seedlings from plants known for their soil-cleansing properties, each in a small pot made from reclaimed materials from the cleanup. My former corporate life in Chicago felt like a distant memory, as we built something neither of us had imagined. Part farm, part environmental education center, and part living laboratory for land restoration. Visitors came from across the country to learn about our story and the techniques we developed. School groups regularly toured the property, children wide-eyed as they learned about the invisible threats that had once lurked beneath the surface, and the innovative solutions that had addressed them. Several universities established research partnerships with us, using our land to test new remediation approaches. Gregory Wellington, who had divorced Diane and relinquished her surname shortly after her conviction, occasionally sent notes about his own journey of redemption. He had retooled his legal practice to focus on representing victims of environmental contamination, often working pro bono for families without the resources to fight corporate polluters. Trying to balance the scales, he wrote in one letter, "Some debts can never be fully repaid, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." As for Diane, prison had not been kind to her. Occasional media reports showed a woman transformed. The designer clothes replaced by prison uniforms, the meticulous highlights grown out to reveal gray roots, the commanding presence diminished by institutional routine. A journalist who interviewed her for a "Where Are They Now" piece reported that other inmates called her the Diane of Cell Block C, and widely avoided her for her continuing demands for special treatment and refusal to acknowledge her crimes. One afternoon, as I was guiding a group of environmental science students through our property, a young woman raised her hand. "Do you ever feel sorry for her? For Diane Wellington?" The question wasn't accusatory, just curious. I paused, looking out over the thriving landscape that had once been poisoned ground. I feel sorry that someone could become so disconnected from the consequences of their actions that they would choose to poison land and endanger people rather than take responsibility, I finally answered. But I don't regret that justice was served. Sometimes the most important lessons come from facing the results of our choices. For this land, that meant healing. For Diane Wellington, it meant accountability. Later that evening, standing with Olivia at the edge of our property as the sun set over fields that were finally, genuinely flourishing, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us here. "You know what's funny?" I said, my arm around her shoulders. "If Diane had just left me alone, I might never have discovered the contamination. Her efforts to drive me away are what ultimately exposed everything she was trying to hide." Olivia smiled, resting her head against my shoulder. "There's probably a lesson there, about how our worst impulses can be our undoing. Or maybe," I added, "about how sometimes locking a Diane in your root cellar is exactly the right thing to do."